This week we're going to look at a text from the Hebrew Bible called Ecclesiastes. This short book represents an interesting window into the philosophy of Judaism, and it's not what you would expect from a religious text. Alright, so first of all, a little bit of background. Those of you familiar with the Bible understand that it is separated into what's called the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament is the Christian way of referring to what Jews call the Hebrew Bible. So all the stuff about Adam and Eve and Noah and Abraham and Moses are part of the Torah or the law. These are the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. There are other books in the Hebrew Bible. There's history, the Kings 1 and 2, the history of the Jewish people. You have the Nevi'im, the prophets, with Samuel, Isaiah, Jeremiah. Then you have the writings, or Ketuvim, which include Psalms, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes. Now, the Hebrew Bible is this hugely influential text, and there's a lot to be said for the mythology of Adam and Eve, Noah, the Great Flood, Abraham, Moses, etc. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on in the history texts, as well as the prophecies. But to look at the philosophy of Judaism as represented in the writings is what we're going to talk about today, and specifically the philosophy seen in this short and weird text called Ecclesiastes. Now, a little bit more background. Now, some people say, when was the Bible written? And that is kind of a weird question to think about. You know, devout religious believers will say that God wrote the Bible and handed it down to Moses or something like this. Scholars date the texts themselves to around 500 before the Common Era, and this the stories predate the writing of the text. Around 1800 before the Common Era is the traditional date of Abraham, embracing monotheism. Moses leads the Jews out of Egypt around 1250 before the Common Era. And it is during the reign of Solomon, from 970 to 931 before the Common Era, where you have a certain degree of consolidation of the Jewish religion, culture, and philosophy. So this short text of the Hebrew Bible, called Ecclesiastes, starts off by saying, "Here are the words of the teacher, son of David, king in Jerusalem." And if you're familiar with Jewish history, you will know that the son of David, who ruled in Jerusalem, was Solomon. So these words in Ecclesiastes are attributed to Solomon, and we see the wisdom and philosophy presented. Now again, what's interesting about this text is it does not present what you would traditionally think to be a faithful or religious worldview. This text is very much in a philosophical tradition of wrestling with the truth, or grappling with the truth, which is reflected in the word Israel, which in Hebrew means one who wrestles with God. So it is this challenging of belief, this challenging of faith that is presented in a religious text, which is what makes it so interesting, essentially, as a piece of philosophy. And how does the text begin? The first chapter, called Vanity of Vanities, states, "All is meaningless, says the teacher. Meaningless, meaningless. What profit is there for a man in all his work for which he toils under the sun? A generation goes, a generation comes, and the earth remains forever. The sun rises, the sun sets, hastening towards the place where it again rises. What has happened before will happen again. What has been done before will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. There is no remembrance of ancient people, and those to come will not be remembered by those who follow them." The starting point of this text is the position of the modern existentialist. What's the point? Why should I bother? Everything seems meaningless. We're all going to die anyway, so who cares? To have this as a starting point in a religious text is interesting. I, the teacher, have been king of Israel in Jerusalem. I set my heart on studying and examining critically all that is done under heaven. It is a burdensome task which God has given to the humans. I have seen everything that is done under the sun, but all is meaningless. It is chasing the wind. So I thought to myself, see, I have increased and promoted wisdom more than anyone who ruled Jerusalem before me, and I have experienced to the full both wisdom and knowledge. I set my heart on comparing wisdom with foolish and stupidity, and I discovered that this also is chasing the wind. For the wiser you are, the more worries you have, and the more you learn, the more you suffer. So, right at the outset, Solomon is telling us he has spent some time trying to figure out the meaning of life. He's studied what people do, and he realizes not only is it pointless, but knowledge is also depressing. So this is a very pessimistic outlook as a starting point. And what's interesting is Solomon is going to experiment and toy around with different ideas about what the point of life is, and it is this wrestling with the truth that makes this such a fantastic philosophical text. I said in my heart, I will try pleasure, taste happiness. But I found that was useless. Laughter is foolishness. As for pleasure, what good is it? I thought of cheering my body with wine, while my heart searched for wisdom. So I gave myself to folly, in order to find out what would be good for man to do under the sun throughout his life. I acquired silver and gold, the wealth of kings and nations. I had choir master and singers, and besides that, what most delights men. I'll leave it to you to figure out what that means. Okay, I became great, surpassing all my predecessors in Jerusalem, without losing wisdom. I refused myself nothing that my eyes desired, nor did I deprive my heart of any pleasure. I enjoyed all I undertook, and that was my reward for my work. Now we are starting to see something tangible that Solomon finds meaningful. Okay? The first draft, what's the point of life? It's meaningless. I learned things about life. It was ultimately just depressing. We're all going to die anyway. It's chasing the wind. Now, I pursue pleasure and wine and what most delights men. And then, okay, I enjoyed all I undertook, and that was my reward for my work. This is the beginnings of a constructive, positive philosophy. You work hard, you get rewarded with pleasure, and that's what you can get out of life. But then what about the work that you're doing itself? Solomon goes on to say, "Then I considered all I had achieved by my work, and all the toil it had entailed, and found that it was all meaningless and chasing wind. There is no profit under the sun." So, yes, you have to go to work in order to pay the bills, in order to get the fruits of your labor. But the thing that you're working on at first glance in this part of the text is ultimately all meaningless. Then Solomon returns to his meditation on the value of wisdom. He says, "If the fate of the fool will be mine as well, what did my wisdom profit me? I thought to myself, that too is meaningless. There's no more remembrance of the wise man than of the fool. Both will be forgotten in the days to come. Why is a wise man's death like that of a fool?" Now, of course, the counter argument we can apply is, Solomon, it's been 3,000 years, and yet here we are still reading your text. So maybe being a wise man will get you remembered. However, at his time and place, he had the pessimism to think no one would bother thinking about him after he's dead. Therefore, what's the point of wisdom? But maybe this is a challenge to the reader. Maybe we should not take him at face value. Maybe he's being ironic, okay? He's saying, oh, what's the point of wisdom? We're all going to die anyway. Nobody's going to care. Nothing matters. And then maybe it's your job as a reader to challenge that, to disagree even with him. And we return to pessimism. Solomon says, I hated life, seeing the wrong in everything that is done under the sun. All is meaningless and chasing wind. I hated all I had labored for under the sun, and which I must leave to my successor. Who knows whether he will be foolish or wise? Yet he will be master of all I have achieved by my own efforts and wisdom. That too is meaningless. This is another pessimistic thing going on here. I'm going to work hard, create this business, create something out of my life, and then when I die, my son or whoever will inherit this business. And what if they're fools? And then it is even more so of a pointless endeavor. And I began to despair in my heart over all my labor under the sun. For here was a man who toiled in all wisdom, knowledge, and skill, and he must leave all to someone who has not worked for it. This is meaningless and a great misfortune. For what profit is there for a man in all his work and heart searching under the sun? All his days bring sorrow, his work grief. He hasn't, moreover, peaceful rest at night. That, too, is meaningless. Again, as much as we might start to get a sense of a positive, constructive worldview, Solomon keeps returning to the negative, pessimistic attitude. Is this how we should view the world? Should we be pessimistic? Is there truth in this negative outlook? Or is this a starting point which we should challenge ourselves to create something positive out of? So here we return to something tangible. There is nothing better for man to do than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in his work. I understood that this too comes from the hand of God. So everything's pointless, knowledge is pointless, your heirs might be fools, but you might as well do your work, get your reward, eat and drink, and although you might have sleepless nights stressing out about the future and feel like, what's the point after I'm dead, nothing's gonna matter anyway, well, at least you can have a nice dinner after your day's work, and that dinner is your reward. So, yes, we're aware of the pessimism, but we can still find something to get out of life, which is, at this point, food and drink, and satisfaction in your work. Chapter 3 starts off with this very interesting refrain, which you may recognize from the popular 60s song by the Byrds, but here is the original text, that there is a time for everything. You know, life is not going to be all fantastic. There's going to be a time for good things and time for bad things. There's a time for giving birth, a time for dying, a time for planting, a time for uprooting, a time for killing, a time for healing, a time for knocking down, a time for building, a time for tears, a time for laughter, a time for mourning, a time for dancing. Okay? So you can't expect all of life to be good, and certainly don't expect all of life to be bad. There's good and bad elements. You have to come to terms with this, etc. The most interesting part of this section is the next passage. A time for loving, a time for hating, a time for war, a time for peace. Now, I want to just meditate on this passage for a moment. This text, as part of the Hebrew Bible, represents a cornerstone of Western culture. Okay? The Hebrew Bible is considered very influential for the Christian Bible, very influential for the Muslim culture. Okay? For those of you who are not aware, Muslims also believe that the Hebrew Bible is a holy text. Muslims also believe that Moses and Abraham and Noah and Solomon were part of the official story of monotheism. Now, Christianity has this odd doctrine where Jesus says we should love our enemies as ourselves and pray for those who persecute us. The Christian attitude of turn the other cheek when someone hits you is very pacifistic, okay? So this statement here in chapter 3, verse 8 is part of the Jewish tradition, but is something that the Christian attitude ultimately disagrees with. Now, the Muslim philosophy has a continuity with this attitude here. So, what happens when you get people who believe that there is a time for war and a time for peace, that there is a time for loving and a time for hating? Then you get war, right? Okay? So when you have two cultures who have this as one of their foundational texts, then you can get people who believe it's okay to fight, have wars, and kill each other. Now, chapter 3 jumps around a little bit. We see Solomon say, "What profit is there for a man from all his toils? Finally, I considered the task God gave to the humans. He made everything fitting in its time, but he also set eternity in their hearts, although man is not able to embrace the work of God from the beginning to the end." Alright, so we've talked a little bit about the notion of what's the meaning of life in this text. There's also the ethics of Ecclesiastes. What should I do with my life? And furthermore, what should we as a culture or political society do when it comes to war and peace? But with this section here, I'd just like to say something about the epistemology of Ecclesiastes. How do we know what we know? Okay, Solomon is here telling us that we cannot fully understand the work of God from the beginning to end. We cannot fully understand where everything came from, where everything is going to. So, this induces a certain sense of mysticism into our worldview, okay? We cannot know for sure everything about the universe, alright? Now, some would, of course, challenge this as an anti-scientific mindset. That's not the idea here. Solomon is not being anti-scientific. What Solomon is saying is, as much as we can know about the world, we cannot know everything. That there are certain things which are, by definition, unknowable. This should remind you of Kant's epistemology, where he states he's found it necessary in some cases to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith. This is that sort of idea, that we cannot know everything, and if we want to think or postulate about things we cannot know, at best we could have some faith, but we could never claim knowledge one way or the other when it comes to such far-reaching ideas. This position that we saw in the last slide represents something like agnosticism. We can't really know for sure what's out there. And this is interesting to see in a religious text. And you see this sort of agnostic, borderline materialistic philosophy emerge in this section here, where Ecclesiastes tells us, "I also taught about them how God wants to test them and let them see that they themselves are animals. For the destiny of man and animal is identical, death for one as for the other. Both have the same spirit. Man has no superiority over animals, for all pass away like wind. Both go to the same place, both come from dust and return to dust. Who knows if the spirit of man rises upward, and if the spirit of the beast descends earthward? I understood the best man can do is to be happy in what he does, for that is his lot. For who will take him to see the beyond? Okay, so there's a couple different points to emphasize here. First of all, this is not what you'd expect from a religious text. We're seeing Ecclesiastes tell us that we have the same spirit as animals, that we are animals. Okay, but this is also saying that we don't know if there's a beyond. Okay, we don't know if we're going to rise upward or if the spirit of the beast descends. Okay, who will take us to see the beyond? So this runs in contrast to those religious preachers who would say there is a heaven, there is a hell, and so forth. What Ecclesiastes is telling us is that we can't really say for sure. So there's this view out there that the Jewish tradition is not fully in line with the metaphysics of Christianity and Islam. And a passage like this, you can see that there's not a full-blown, yes, there is a heaven, yes, there is a hell. It's more of a maybe, who knows kind of attitude. So the best you can do is to be happy with your life here on earth, because that's your lot. And we return to the pessimism. This section here is the most pessimistic. I considered also how much oppression there is under the sun, the tears of the oppressed and no one to console them, the violence of the oppressors and no one to hold them back. More fortunate are the dead for being dead than the living who have to live. And even more fortunate than both is the one not yet born, who has not seen the abuses under the sun. So this is Ecclesiastes at its most pessimistic, right? There's so much oppression out there. There's so many people that are having to deal with these horrible things and no one can help them out. It's almost better off to be either dead or not born at all, so as not to have to deal with any of this stuff or know about it. So we don't know if there's an afterlife. We don't know if there's a point of life. There's all this horrible tragedy, but we know that we can do our own work. But even that is not enough, right? You have to have somebody inherit the work that you do on this planet. So here's Ecclesiastes. I saw another senseless thing under the sun, a man alone, without son or brother, working endlessly, his greed never satisfied with wealth. For whom do I work and deprive myself of pleasure? This too is nonsense and mistaken investment. Okay, 2 points to emphasize here. The first, the central point of this passage, if you're going to do something with your life, you have to have someone there to pick up where you leave off, or else what's the point, right? It's not just about your own pursuit of wealth and pleasure, but there has to be some sort of long-standing continuity. So this creates a culture of having family businesses, family traditions, things getting passed from one generation to the next. Alright, this connects over to this phrase, under the sun, which appears again and again throughout this text, but I just would like to emphasize for a moment right now. This repeated passage, under the sun, under the sun, under the sun, what does it mean? Okay, what's under the sun is the world in front of you, okay, the physical earth. And that is what Ecclesiastes is talking about and is concerned with. What are you doing with your life under the sun? You know, who knows what's beyond this? Who knows what's earthward or heavenward or afterward or any of that stuff? The metaphysics of life is mysterious. Who knows what's going on there? But as far as our life is concerned under the sun, that's where our attention should be focused, and that's where our efforts should lie. So, the emphasis for Ecclesiastes of where our priorities are under the sun. That's where we should be concerned with. So what emerges is something like a materialistic philosophy. Okay? This is not a very metaphysical philosophy. This is not about doing what's right in heaven and all that kind of stuff. This is more about doing what's right here on earth under the sun. Okay, one subject that hasn't come up yet is marriage. Another big part of Ecclesiastes' positive philosophy is that we should all get marriage. And the argument is interesting because it's not about love, soulmates, all that kind of stuff that we think of nowadays. Here's the argument he puts forth in this section. Happier two than one alone, for their work brings a higher salary. And when one falls, the other lifts up his companion. Unfortunate he who is alone and has no one to lift him up. Moreover, it's warmer with two in bed. How can one alone be warm? One person may be overcome by an aggressor, but two can easily oppose him. Triple-stranded thread is not easily broken. Why should we get married? Because two incomes pays the bills better. If one person is struggling, the other person can help him out. You can also save on your heating expenses by having two people in a bed. Okay? It's a very practical view of marriage. The last passage here about triple-stranded thread, I once had a student argue that this was in support of polygamy. I can't say that that's totally out of the question. I'll leave it up for you to interpret. So we get a reiteration of the positive philosophy. This is what I saw as most fitting for man, to eat, drink, and be happy in all the work he does under the sun during the days God grants him. This is his reward. This passage here I find to be a good summary in one sentence of the ideas in this text. Enjoy life with the wife you love all the days of the meaningless life given you by God under the sun, for this is your lot in life and in the work you do under the sun. Okay, life is meaningless, but that's what it is. You might as well just enjoy it, get married, enjoy the life you have while you have it. That's what the best you can hope for. So, yes, it's meaningless, but there's something is still better than nothing. So, Ecclesiastes starts from a zero position of almost complete nihilism and then gives us a little something to hang our hat on. And this repeated refrain about your life's work is in the next passage really hammered home. Fulfill your projects while you are able, for among the dead where you are going, there is no work, no planning, no knowledge, no wisdom. You only have the life that's been given to you, the days of your life under the sun. You don't know what comes after. So if there's something you want to do, get to work. Now, the other thing about this passage, you could say, what are the metaphysics here? Oh, is there a beyond that we're going to? Maybe this suggests an afterlife. Well, what would you be doing? There's no work, no planning, no knowledge, no wisdom. I mean, spending eternity lying on a cloud listening to a harp, possibly. But that might get boring, wouldn't you think? So if you're going to do something, if you're going to make an effort, you have to do it while you're alive. My argument that there's a certain anti-metaphysical philosophy in this text, as well as a certain mystical epistemology, is supported by these passages I'd just like to point out briefly. Naked he came from his mother's womb, he returns as he came, naked. Nothing of the fruit of his toil is he able to take with him. I read this as something like, you make an effort to do something here on this planet, and then when you die, that's it. Okay, the next passage. He has no knowledge of what will happen. Who can tell him what will happen? Okay, this again, this idea that the metaphysics of what's out there is something we cannot claim knowledge of. Okay, and this is reiterated in 11:5. Just as you do not know how the Spirit pervades the members in the mother's womb, neither will you understand the work of God, creator of all things. Why am I emphasizing these passages? When you hear a religious speaker, a lot of the times there is a claim to knowledge. I know what God wants for you. I know God's purpose for us. I know God wants X, Y, Z, right? What Ecclesiastes is telling us here is, no, you do not, and you shouldn't claim it either, okay? You cannot know the big picture, the big plan. You cannot know what's behind things. And this is a little more intellectually credible to say, you know what, we don't know what's really out there. So this is just a caution, a little bit of a putting of brakes on the theology of some religious speakers. Furthermore, you could flip the coin over and say to the atheists, well, how can you be so sure that there's nothing, right? How can you be so sure that there's no metaphysical truth out there? How can you have so much confidence that there is nothing? So, the position of Ecclesiastes is very similar to the position of Kant. It's essentially an agnostic, who knows, there might be something, but it's not for us to say one way or the other. Now, aside from the larger themes that tie together this text, it's just worth pointing out just a couple little odds and ends in the text. Okay? Here, this passage, whoever obeys a royal precept avoids trouble. The wise man knows the time and the judgment, the time to act, and the value of everything. Okay? There's a couple layers here that we should address. First of all, we have to remind ourselves that Solomon was the king of Israel ruling in Jerusalem. So, maybe this passage here is a message to his subjects, you know, behave or you'll be in trouble because I'm in charge, I'm the ruler, right? I would go a layer deeper and say that this is a message to us about whether or not it is worth it to disobey the ruler, right? You might know that the rules are wrong, but should you really stand up and demand attention for injustices, right? What would be the cost of that? Well, it might be your life, right? Taken with the whole agnostic metaphysics, who knows what comes beyond, we all turn to dust in the end. Maybe you tie that together and you say, life is too short and too precious, there are these oppressors out there, maybe I should just keep my mouth shut and stay alive, rather than be a conscientious objector and die for some cause. Here's another piece of text which could be read as an authoritarian decree or a message to the dissidents. Even in your mind do not curse the king, and in your bedroom do not curse the rich, for the birds of the air may tell what you say, and winged carriers will make it known. Alright, so maybe this is read from the voice of authority. Don't disobey, don't even think about being a critic. We'll be listening, you know, Solomon is here anticipating the NSA state that we live under now. But maybe he's also speaking to us as a sympathetic person, right? Don't be a dissident, a critic, don't curse the rich, don't curse the king, because what's it going to get you? You have your life's work to do. You have your marriage, you have your food and drink, and someone to inherit your life's work, right? You have your small little piece of the world to take care of. So what does it matter to you if the king is oppressive or if the rich have a lot of money? You focus on what you can do on your piece of the universe, and that's all that really matters. And as the text closes, we hear the refrain from the beginning. Meaningless, meaningless, the teacher says, all is meaningless. Beware, my son, of searching beyond. Writing many books would be useless, and intense study wearies the body. Conclusion. Fear God and obey his precepts, for man depends entirely on this. God brings every deed to judgment, all that is hidden, be it good or bad. What's interesting about this last section of the text is how much the final two sentences kind of seem like they don't fully fit with the rest of the text. Now, the previous two slides, we saw the argument of behave, don't be a dissident, but then we also see the wise man knows the value to act and a time for everything. We also saw previously there's a time for war, a time for peace, right? So, should we just be obedient subjects and do as we're told? Or is this last bit like the seal of approval from the voice of authority? Like, yes, there's all this mysterious, meaningless wrestling with the truth, but at the end of the day, you have to do what you're told and obey God, right? But is this the thing that lets this text stay in the canon? There was a lot of debate over whether Ecclesiastes should be even considered part of the Hebrew Bible or even the Christian Bible. And this last passage is what, at the end of the day, gets it into the book, right? Yes, you can wrestle with the truth all you want, but as long as you come to the right conclusion at the end, it's all well and good, right? Go backpack around Europe, but as long as you come back home and get a regular job after 6 months or a year, we don't really care, kind of thing. Take it with a grain of salt is my idea. Stick with the wrestling and the challenging notion of this text. Beware taking everything at face value here. The true spirit of this text is a spirit of a back and forth, of a philosophical asking of questions. And for me, the sum total of this text is in the passage we've seen previously. Enjoy life with the wife you love, all the days of the meaningless life given you by God under the sun, for this is your lot in life, and in the work you do under the sun. Okay? You're given a certain amount of time here. You have this life under the sun. Might as well just deal with the fact that it's meaningless. Get married. Get a job. Figure something out. Do something with your time here on earth. But at the end of the day, it's ultimately all meaningless.